All right, so we looked at Adam Smith last time in the beginning of classical economics. And as we had on the board at that time, all of this is to be contrasted with mercantilist theory that was standard in the early modern West before Smith, and even afterwards, while people were still being convinced. Well, let me cite the, and I don't usually do this, but let me cite the Wikipedia description of mercantilism just to give it more weight than perhaps critics of what I'm saying would give to me. So I'll let Wikipedia say it. No friend to the free market system. It says, quote, mercantilism is an economic policy that is designed to maximize the exports and minimize the imports for an economy. So you say, well, you'll see an anti-free trade element in there. But here's the part I really wanted to focus on. It promotes imperialism, tariffs and subsidies on traded goods to achieve that goal, balance of trades. These policies aim to reduce a possible current account deficit or reach a current account surplus. Mercantilism includes measures aimed at accumulating monetary reserves through a positive balance of trade, especially of finished goods. Historically, such policies frequently led to war and also motivated colonial expansion, end quote. So Wikipedia does a good job there of explaining what mercantilism is and what it's motivated to do, and what it has done historically. In short, what history recognizes as slavery and colonialization in the modern West is a direct consequence of the early modern economic program of mercantilism, and not, as the past three generations were brainwashed in the plantation school system and slave culture in general, as being somehow the products of Christianity and even capitalism. And we can see clearly why this is the case. Mercantilism is founded on the principle of zero sum, the violence of redistribution. So you have these two or more zero-sum pies. It's solid. It's not like we talked about with capitalism expanding. But if I'm going to increase, the size of my pie, I have to take it from you, whether that's in the form of physical resources or whether it's in the form of people in chains or whatever it is. That zero-sum fallacy, and we'll do a whole session on fallacies. So I did all that work and there we go. I put my eraser over there. That zero-sum assumption stands behind both mercantilism and socialism, which is why socialism, as Hayek said, is the road to serfdom. It will just eventually lead to another form of slavery for that very reason. Okay. So what's behind Smith, and we'll say one more thing about Smith, but just in general, because he didn't develop a sophisticated vision of the price system, and I'll put that up here because what we want to look at is the role of prices. And we're going to just call this the price system to talk about one of those things that are basic to economic activity, which command economies just try to ignore. But they still have to run by it, but it's just going to be repressed. Smith didn't develop a sophisticated theory of this, but he did explore it from the perspective of value. And we're only going to look at this briefly, and the reason we're going to do it is just to see just a little evolution of money and what money's for. And we're not going to look at that for the purpose of monetary policy because we don't have time to get into that. It's not a big economics class. We're going to look at that in turn. Eventually, we're getting to all of this only to drive to the relationship between money and goods, to look at GDP, to look at inflation, to look at those things. That's the only reason we're going to look at it. So just briefly, Smith talked about value in use, in other words, a product's utility, versus value in exchange. I'll write those up there. Value in use, I'll just do it below it. Value in exchange. I haven't conceived this out yet, what a picture would look like, but there's going to be an exchange of goods and that's going to be inefficient in a certain way, but we'll get to that. These are very different things. Something's value in use versus its value in exchange. For example, what is more valuable to use than water, soil, air, but try selling those. I was, I think it was at Walmart. Yeah, Walmart. My wife yesterday, she's like, I'm getting a can of air. And I thought of that scene in Spaceballs. I'm like, what are you talking about? But anyway, but you know what I'm talking about, just actual air. Yeah, of course, not a big market for that. Or water, the water stand, the lemonade stand. It's like one notch down. So obviously, even the old system of the bartering system, so like cattle or salt, those had the disadvantages when you're exchanging them of matching up everything you need with the little of the other good that they need. Not to mention the disadvantages of storing and transporting, hauling all those cattle around, but then even matching it up. It's like the perennial, hot dog buns versus hot dogs conundrum. You never get the right amount, so you got to go back to the store to get to break that unevenness. Well, these are the kind of problems in the bartering system, except more serious. And hence the evolution of metal bars, and then finally minted coins. Conversely, diamond and gold are valuable, but almost wholly unusable. The real measure of this exchange is the price of commodities. Smith talked about parts of this, objective factors of this, and that makes up a big chunk of the rest of his argument. But we're going to take our leave of Smith here. Again, we're bringing this up to talk about what prices are and what they do. And I was bringing that up to talk about a real versus nominal price of something. And that's going to set us up for matching up money to the real goods, and hopefully those rising at the same time. But what are prices and what do they do? Well, prices are descriptive, but they're also normative. But we have to understand them descriptively first, what they are, in order to see really what they do and why you can't ignore them when you're trying to set up your wish list for what we should do to make the world a better place. Let's look at that descriptive level first. There's a certain supply of goods and services available at any given time. And there's a certain amount of money the market is willing to pay for that amount of goods or that kind of good. And the price of that resource is its market value. Now, as to the economy as a whole, we still use Smithian language to distinguish between the real versus the nominal price of commodities. The real value or the real price, and if it helps, if you have background in philosophy in some of our classes, remember realism and nominalism? Real is the essence of realism is treating universals like the essence of something that really exists in its essence, as opposed to nominalism, which is treating predicates like this thing is just, this thing is good, this thing is, one, or whatever it is. And that thing is only a useful name. So if you can understand the difference between realism and nominalism in philosophy, you can understand maybe a little bit of the relationship between money, paper money, for example, and the good that it's backing up. Okay? So Smith uses the word labor in this context, as we saw, whereas the nominal price of things is their price in money. And remember that the money was only invented as that medium of exchange because it was better than cows, better than salt. And when metal money showed up, it was better in two ways. Metals were far less perishable, and secondly, metals were far more divisible, and yet they retained their purpose. So you could transport them, you could store them, you could regulate them, some government could, in terms of making sure that it was the same thing. And so money, here's where we're driving at. Money is valuable only insofar as it accurately represents, or in other words, it accurately matches up to the exact sum of goods valued for use. Okay, so that's going to be crucially important to proper monetary policy, or not saying dumb things at election time like I produced such and such amount of jobs. This person produced, or why don't they just print more money or so? Well, they can do that, but I would strongly recommend against that for this reason. Okay, so let's introduce some more grammar at this point. Yeah, let's do it over here because I'm going to use an analogy later, and there'll be a counter in the middle, so I'll put supply over there and demand over here. And we're not, again, this is not an economics class, so we're not going to draw any charts or anything like that at this point. Just basic stuff here. Since my analogy later will be of hamburgers and this person's just offering money for something, and across the counter you've got, forgive my art, I didn't even think about this beforehand. That's good enough. That's a burger. That's going to work, okay? So, of course, a lot goes into that. Bread, meat, we'll talk about those things in just a little bit. But supply is what we call the total of that resource, whatever it is. And it could be from the suppliers, just the bread, grain, commodity, just the meat, cattle, so on back, and then forward as they collect in the one product. Now the supply is not the suppliers, now just the counter, now the seller. Okay, so we can mean either by supply. And the aggregate desire of those in the market that they have for that particular good is what we call demand. The price is a kind of snapshot. And I stress that it's a snapshot. Let's do that because that's what we're used to seeing, just to represent in our dollars. The price is a kind of snapshot where supply and demand meet. And we would define the cost of anything as the value that it has in alternative uses. So this guy has, this is A. Over here, he could take that same dollar, and I'll put it in dotted line, and that's B. He has a cost, and in this case it's B because he sacrificed that to get A in this game of trade-offs or alternative uses. He's done cost-benefit analysis, and he has determined that this is more valuable to him for that price than this. But this is still his cost. That's going to happen over here, too. They're going to produce this instead of, I don't know, the chicken sandwich on the menu, whatever. Yeah, but they have a cost as well. They're going to hire a worker and not build a new shelf, whatever. Okay? So the value that it has in alternative uses we call the cost. Basic 101 here. For example, if I hire an employee, or else B, purchase new equipment, the cost to my business is B if I chose A, or A if I chose B. Did I do A and B? Yes, I did A and B over there. Of course, A and B is often oversimplified, but that's the idea. Now, right away, we can start to field some basic 101 objections that come up during election time when you don't think about this all the other times, or if you just haven't taken a class. Objection 1, suppliers can set prices for whatever they want to. We're at their mercy. My reply to that is not quite, or at least not in general. In isolation, yes, it's true. Suppliers can, in isolation, make their price whatever they want to in a free market, or sellers. However, they would quickly be outsold and driven out of business by a market that would rather pay less. The multiplicity of competitors and consumers are really what set the pace. So the freer the competition and more of this you have, the more prices naturally driven down by that same series of that self-interest we talked about last time. Okay? Objection 2, not so fast. You talk about competition, but monopolies, plenty of monopolies have existed, and they can easily buy out any competition, thus ensuring their monopoly and their ability to set high prices. My reply is that is true too, but it actually proves too much. Now, there's a couple of responses I can give to this. I only want to give the most general, just to show you that even where you're right, you still are going to give us a remedy that'll kill us. Okay, this proves too much. If our choices are between a naturally forming monopoly or government fiat monopolies, and that is our choice because your remedy against the free market is to replace Rockefeller and Gates with a nationalized version of oil or PC. Gates's PCs. And we can all be against those characters in particular. But the latter option, that nationalized version of them, has some disadvantages. Number one, it hides the high cost in other parts of the federal budget. So it doesn't do away with those forces. What you lose in the market side is you lose the growth to the economy. Now, we still haven't completely explained why that is yet, but we'll get to that supply side versus demand side. Second disadvantage is now by force of law, which Gates and Rockefeller don't have and can only have it by getting in bed with the politicians, and you forgetting everything we talked about in this class and letting the government do that by crony capitalism, which is not a genuine free market. But now by force of law, in your remedy, that can negate any possible competition. But in either case, it will only be competition that will drive down the price in a sustainable way. So I'd rather have the monopoly that doesn't have tanks and tasers and the government get out of the way so that people can compete with them versus the alternatives. Okay, more could be said about that to make a stronger argument, but I just want to give you a lay of the land. Here's another example of how people try to solve the problems of the price system. Supposing you want to solve the problem of high prices in education, housing, or medicine. So you're talking about some real 101 stuff. Competition with burgers, Matt. This stupid example. Burgers are plentiful. We don't really need them anyway. They make us morbidly obese. But man, when it comes to medicine, education, housing, your free market doesn't work because we all need those things. All right. I would say it goes the other way around. So other arguments can be used that are stronger. But if you demand a government-run economy that works not by the price system, reflecting market forces, but by fiat based on what's fair for everyone, we have some problems. Number one, you can't do that anyway. You're going to try to cheat something that's basic to economics. So remembering that the price simply reflects the exact supply that exists plus the demand for it. The price is just a snapshot of what people are willing to do, what they naturally do, okay? The basic trouble is that the supply is going to remain just as it is. Supply of teachers, supply of doctors, supply of medicine, supply of innovation, what was the other industry I used? Supply of housing. At first, they will remain just as they are, but now you've got one massive problem that's going to shift that in a bad way. Whether we consider education, housing, or medicine, we still have a product that somebody is now going to have to produce on behalf of those who are simply owed it. Not based on how good of a product I can convince you that you want and you saying, yes, I want that through voluntary exchange, but now they will be forced to produce it, responding only to what this bureaucratic elite says you owe them, and so forth and so on. So now, with no incentive to produce it, much less to produce it with any increased excellence, allocation is still going to be responding to signals, except the real value for the objective nature of the products and real people will give way to a nebulous concept of equality. Now, these guys, I didn't draw them in. The bureaucratic elite that's going to be now saying you give to them and them at this time in this way, they're still trying to read price signals. But for reasons we're going to talk about, they can do that infinitely less efficiently than each of these individuals in their own sphere. Now, we've tried this before and it didn't work. In the 1970s, for example, with gasoline, trying to break up, trying to solve that problem. There's several problems they tried to solve, one being monopoly, the other being the supposed oil and energy crisis, because we're all going to die because the world's overpopulated in the next 10 years. And then when that prophecy fails, I meant in the next 10 years, and then so on, and Al Gore and the whole 9 yards. But back in the 1970s, this gas rationing led to excess in some areas, but more famously, the part we will remember, long gas lines and shortages in other areas. Rent controls, same thing. Rent controls typically lead to a decrease in the supply of housing, which again pressures the price upward. These are real people that need to supply these things. If you don't incentivize them to keep doing it, they'll get out of that market. Price controls on businesses and loans in lower income communities ignore that the price for doing business there is higher for a lot of reasons, security, and other reasons, taxation, the regulation on that property and so forth. that ignores all of that. That price is naturally higher. And so what you do by setting those price controls is you drive those suppliers right out of the market. They're no longer incentivized to do business in the inner city. And so all of this to say that this price system is an objective thing. Prices are what I call the DNA of the market economy. There's the 3 I's. So the DNA in us, you have these 4 other letters. Here, it's super simple. There's I's, 3 I's. Prices perform 3 functions in organizing economic activity. First, they transmit information. And we'll see this more in detail, so I'll leave this aside for a little bit. But they transmit information to suppliers and to the commodity producers and to the people with the price checkers at Walmart. They transmit information to them, and they in turn transmit that information to their supervisor. And it also does the same for consumers. And so information is the first I. Secondly, they provide an incentive. Prices, as we've already seen, provide an incentive to adopt those methods of production that are least costly and thereby use available resources for the most highly valued purpose. So they do this at the lowest cost, and they cause resources to flow to the most valued, in the form of demand, the most valued part of the market. So what's happening naturally by that invisible hand that we talked about last time is infinitely superior to a bureaucratic elite doing that on the basis of things that are nice concepts that are not really real anyway. And so that's why it fails every time. How do 200 million hicks and uneducated people who I can't trust to make their own decisions constantly do this more superior in every way than a bureaucratic elite of my smart friends do? It's because you don't understand, and so you're not that smart if you don't understand this part of economics. Okay, and so thirdly, prices determine, and so this is the third I, income. So these are your 3 I's, the DNA of economic activity in the price system. Prices determine who gets how much of the product, the distribution of income. In other words, that allocation, or the last part of the allocation part. The obvious rule behind this is that consumers will buy more at lower prices and less at higher prices. Conversely, on this side, suppliers will produce more at higher prices. Remember the rent ceilings, price ceilings, drove suppliers out of that market. Suppliers will produce more at higher prices and less at lower prices. You're incentivizing them to do one or the other. That sets us up to understand inflation. And this is the last part I'll talk about, and I'll bring in my analogy. Inflation and deflation. And so I'm glad I did use the example of the burger. And right here will be a counter. This is a counter. Okay? Simple terms. Inflation occurs. Okay? And so I'm going to do this to represent that this price went up, and we're going to call that inflation. What is inflation? Simple terms. Inflation occurs when a greater amount of money chases the same amount of goods. And when this happens, suppliers are incentivized to raise the price of their product to accommodate the bidding war that ensues. An illustration will help. Okay? So imagine a world, I don't know if you ever saw the movie, what was it? Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone. It was in the early 90s, and Taco Bell had won the franchise war. All restaurants and all kinds of food in the future are now called Taco Bell. Okay? Well, we're not going to go that direction. We already picked burgers. So imagine a world, like in Twilight Zone. Imagine a world, if you will, where the only one that exists is BK, Burger King. And what happened is, all of a sudden, overnight, for no particular reason, Taco Bell, Chick-fil-A, Subway, what did I have? Pizza Hut. So you have 4 representatives here. All went out of business. And just to make this super simple and get our minds wrapped around it, ordinarily 30 customers come in during the lunch hour. Ordinarily, this is 30. That 30 represents 30 customers, comes in, spending $10 average, $10 to get their lunch. So it's burger, it's whatever, it's everything. Okay, so at $10, 30 of them, which of course normally would have equaled 300. Well, let's put it down here to put the price that goes up. That would be $300 during that lunch hour. But Taco Bell, Chick-fil-A, Subway, and Pizza Hut brought their 30, and I'm oversimplifying everything just so we can get the point. Brought their 30, 60, 90, 120. So you have an increase of 120 at $10. And so now they're bringing in this over here. And I didn't even do the math yet, but obviously that's going to drive that up to 1,500. Again, we're just oversimplifying everything. I have no earthly idea how much they take in an hour at their lunchtime rush. So oversimplified. But why does this happen? Well, now these hands with these dollar bills are doing this times 5, right? Or whatever it was. Add another restaurant if that works out. But you get the idea. Something similar to an auction is taking place, okay? And so that increases the price one way or the other. Okay, one of two prices is going to go up, or both. The price at the counter, if current supply of buns, burger patties, cheese, etc., if they can't meet the influx of demand now at that increase, okay, now you say, well, Burger King's got this, we know about inflation already. Burger King was resourceful, saw all this coming, and so they accommodated by increasing supply. But some price is still going to go up with the meat or bread suppliers, as there is now a greater demand for those products so the problem moves a step back and the price goes back over here with the bread or the meat suppliers or the cheese suppliers, the pickles, whatever it is, okay? Because now there's a greater demand of the product between sellers and suppliers. Now, on the other hand, let's suppose the suppliers or Burger King overproduced. They really saw this coming. Just reverse the situation in some way in your imagination. Burger King made this prediction, but it was all wrong. Let's now pretend. We'll see that in Keynesian economics, that fear of overproduction. We'll see this. Just an oversimplified example. Well, now they would have to liquidate their surplus at a lower price. So now you've got this thing not happening, but it's the same amount of money over here, the 300, but now you've got an excess of these things on your shelf. They're just going to get mold and whatever else. And so now, instead of the bidding war this way, now it's coming this way where you're going to have to reduce the price of these. And maybe more people come in, they hear about it, and they're going to buy this at $1 instead of at $10. So whatever it is, that we call deflation. Okay? What's this got to do with anything? Because usually this doesn't happen in one particular place. One place that it does happen is in your monetary policy. Is if you did listen to all those voters who think that the government produces wealth, and especially, let's just say, well, just print more money. Well, that's why you would bring in this excess, this glut of paper goods that no longer represent. So in the stockpile of your whole economy, you now have, so let's say your dollar amount is exactly this much with your GDP, your gross domestic product, your stuff. And somebody said, hey, I know, well, let's just create sunshine and happiness and free ponies. And let's just print money. Well, if you do that, and it's not backed, and when you hear people talk about people losing the purchasing power of the dollar or something like that, okay, what's happening there is inflation. Because you've created more, by X amount, you've created more money above and beyond chasing the same amount of goods. The value of the dollar has gone down in terms of its purchasing power, which, by the way, kills the poor. Let's help the poor by printing more money. You'll kill the poor. Don't ever do that. It's hyperinflation is the result. Anyway, I'm going to leave the next section for the next session, and we'll continue on with classical economic theory. I don't know that we'll even get to Marx and Keynes next time, but we will talk about the 19th century and some other theories that started to build on Smith's theory. So we'll get to that next time.